So yesterday we saw Democrats in Congress come forward with their police reform bill in response to a number of the activist cries that we've seen across the country. We've been seeing protests all over the place. But they also decided to kneel for 8 minutes in honor of George Floyd. And you can see in this picture here, they're wearing the Kente cloth. Now, Chris, I want to talk to you a little bit about this because there was a lot of criticism online from a number of black activists saying that this was inappropriate. Now, apparently, they did get they were asked to do this by the Black Caucus. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I read is the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus invited them or encouraged
Hmm.
them or something to do this. You never really know if that was story
Right.
that was made up later after to kind of make it seem like it was okay. But that is
Right.
definitely what stood out to me because I tuned in for a little bit to the press briefing they were having when they were announcing all of this, and that yellow, how do you say it again? The
It's Kente cloth. Yeah.
Kente cloth. It stands out and it jumps out at you right away, and you definitely start to take notice of it. And then you start to wonder, okay, what is the purpose of them wearing this? Is this really a substantial, meaningful thing that they're doing, or is it just
Right.
meant as some kind of a signal to immediately make people think, oh, I'm with you, I'm on your side, and then they don't have to go as far in the actual substance of the bill.
Right, because what we don't want to get involved in, what we don't want to get trapped in, is this whole thing of like symbolic gesturing and then not
Right.
delivering real systemic change, which is something that Democrats have been accused of for basically forever, right? But I mean, this is a definitely an instance where, like you were saying, it's the most noticeable thing, right? You see that immediately, and they're all wearing this kente cloth. It's definitely not something that you typically see them wear, and there was a lot of criticism again. Even GQ, fashion GQ came out, and which, by the way, GQ made the uniforms for the Nazis. Which anyway, but GQ came out to slam them, saying that this is the end of fashion politics, saying that this is not appropriate, that fashion symbolism is not the future of politics. So it's really interesting to see a magazine about fashion coming out making commentary on politics like that. I just thought that was absolutely fascinating here. Now let's get into a little bit about their bill, right? Because if the criticism is that they're doing symbolic gesturing, then that would imply that they haven't done anything substantive, and that's going to rest, right? That argument is going to, hinge on whether or not the bill that they're proposing delivers the kind of systemic change which activists are talking about. So they're talking about things like ending qualified immunity, changing the federal standard for criminal police behavioring from something known as willful and the sort of criterion in order to prosecute to knowingly or with reckless disregard. So it would be a little bit easier to prosecute a police officer for bad action. They're going to start a federal registry for police misconduct. They're going to ban the use of chokehold, something which was already banned in Minneapolis and in New York for Eric Garner, and also in the case of George Floyd. They're going to stop the use of no-knock search warrants for drug cases and a few other main things. The other main thing that everybody is talking about is that they are going to curb but not eliminate the transfer of military grade weapons from the military to local and state police department. Also, they're going to be classifying lynching as a federal hate crime. So that's some of the stuff that they're doing. And look, all of those things I'm in support of. They're also talking about issues with, pattern practice and implicit bias training for officers, something which was also being used in Minneapolis. But the city council came out specifically and explicitly said, look, man, this is not working. This implicit bias training doesn't seem to be having any effect on anything at all. So it does seem, at least on first glance, sort of prima facie, that there isn't a clear or systemic approach. Chris, what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, I kind of have mixed feelings on this because, in some sense, the things that are in the bill I agree with, but I also feel like it's insufficient. I mean, I guess the way I would categorize it, it's the least they could do, right? So we're kind of in this historic moment of history. I mean, if a few weeks ago someone had said a police officer was going to murder someone in the streets and the whole country would rise up, you'd kind of go, yeah, I don't think that's actually going to happen. But that's where we're at. Is that the whole this has captured the attention of the entire country,
And the
and I feel
world.
like yeah, and the world, right, exactly, and the world, and I feel like this response is insufficient. But then at the same time, you kind of get bogged down in this whole idea that police forces are local, usually city centered, and then the state can affect the police somewhat. And this is a national bill that we're talking about, so there's only so much that they could actually do. But it would have been nice to see more. What I'm kind of seeing here is a mainstream message. It's more for, like, the mainstream Democrats, not people that are very far left, can get on board with this kind of stuff. But it certainly doesn't rise to the level of what the most people at the protests are calling for, and the kind of change that they'd like to see.
Right. It clearly does not meet the moment, right? Like we are in a moment where change is finally possible. One of the things that I've been sort of following when it comes to politics, when it comes to this coronavirus thing, is it does seem like politics can be tick tock for a long time. And then suddenly there's a moment when it seems like, wow, maybe something could really happen. Maybe we can really do some clear change. And this is one of those moments more than more than just about any moment that I've seen in my lifetime. This is a moment, maybe with the exclusion of 9/11, for which I was a tiny baby at the time. This is a moment when something could actually happen. This is a moment when political capital becomes just a word. This is a moment when change can really happen, and they're going about with the same ideology that they always have. Look, it is true, absolutely. You're absolutely right that when it comes to the sort of distinction between sort of federal, local, and state governments, most of police issues is a local affair. That is absolutely true. But it also, when you think about the sort of ideology underlying the stuff that we're seeing from the Democrats here, it's this same idea of seeing social problems across the country as finally police problems. But police can't solve social issues. All they can do is shift things away from public view. I think, Chris, about one of the major debates which goes on in Fairfax County when it comes to homelessness, which is that Virginia state law mandates that if you're in an intersection, you can be there, right? Like it's a public place, you can be there, and so police officers aren't allowed to kick homeless people who are asking for money out of the streets, but it's something which a lot of people. Unfortunately, Fairfax County being, a wealthier area of the country, there's a lot of people out there who just don't want to see it. And so they want police officers to move people around. I worked in Fairfax County government for a while, and I'll never forget this phone call I got. This one man was mad about this homeless person who was, I guess near his home. And I want the police to move him. I want the police to do something about it. And I was like, well, they can't do anything, blah, blah, blah. And then he starts yelling at me and tells me, to drive down there and pick him up and drop him off in a neighboring county. He didn't care what happened to him. He just didn't want to see him. And I think that this same kind of mentality of, well, social problems, I just don't want to see them. Well, we're just going to put them, where are we going to put them? I don't know. Let's put them in jail. Let's not really think about it. And I think that, this ideology here is underlined. I think that you're right. Like, I think you're absolutely right. There isn't a ton that they can do, although they can end the military transfer program instead of just trying to curb it. Um, it is true that there's not like a ton that they can actively do to change, but you can see there in that ideology, in the sort of things that they're saying, they're not trying to reformulate those incentives, reformulate the incentives of trying to
Right.
move away from the idea of police officers as solving social issues. They're just trying to, okay, well, a police officer did a bad thing. Let's prosecute that officer a bit more.
Yeah, and there are still issues, I think, that take place on both the federal and local level that could be addressed, like the war on drugs, which is, back since Nancy Reagan was saying just say no. This is something that there's lots of efforts and money spent to fight it at the federal level, and there's lots of efforts to fight it at the local level. And after we've had over 40 years of this, the current situation doesn't seem to be working. We have all these people under the current opioid crisis and all sorts of stuff. The war on drugs isn't working. That would be something that it would be good if they could have put more in the bill about shifting away from that, like sort of changing the way we approach the war on drugs. Um, and
Yeah.
like the homelessness issue that you talked about, I know for a few years where I am, like in Southern California, beach communities just have large issues with the homeless population, right? And so a few years back, the city I lived in, they actually created these people. I forget what their official title is, but they're on bikes and they ride around and they've got these red shirts on. So the homelessness issue, unless it's becoming an issue, isn't handled by the police, right?
Oh, wow.
Um, it's handled by these special people that are trained specifically in what services can we offer, and they're trained in how to interact with people who are in the kind of homeless situation, and what can we do to get you off the streets, what can we do to help you so that you're not here in this situation. Because sometimes the beaches and certain parks in the neighborhood are known. It's where a lot of drugs are taking place, and behavior where people don't necessarily want to take their families to these kinds of parks and stuff. So this crew will come in and try to actually give help in a way that police officers just aren't prepared to do
Hmm.
that kind of thing. So that's actually a shift in thinking rather than just, like this bill that we're talking about, which to me, almost everything in there is absolutely obvious. Yeah, there should be a registry so that if some cop gets fired for horrible behavior, that person shouldn't then get to be a cop somewhere else. There should be some kind of a registry for that. To me, that's no brainer stuff. It's not stuff that is really going to institutionally change the way that things work.
Right, and even where it is a no-brainer, again, those things aren't like you're saying, they're not really actually trying to change things around there. I'd love it actually, Chris, after this conversation, if you sent me a link to some of that stuff that's going on in your community. That's definitely something which would be
Sure.
pretty interesting, pretty useful to take a look at. Now, the thing when it comes to this whole police general debate is we're also starting to see Donald Trump come out and trying to frame Joe Biden as basically being a captive of the far left, right? So Donald Trump coming out saying that, oh, well, Joe Biden's just too afraid to truly admit how he really feels, or also trying to say, oh, well, Joe Biden is, he might be a moderate at heart, but he knows that he's just going to be dragged by the far left. And so he's trying to, wiggle around the words when it comes to this thing. So, I mean, we've seen recent polling showing Joe Biden absolutely obliterating Donald Trump in the polls. Donald Trump is getting absolutely curb stomped right now by Joe Biden, which is not a sentence that I ever imagined that I would ever say ever. I mean, Donald Trump was having a Twitter panic about it, I think just yesterday or maybe 2 days ago. And so it's interesting how this is playing out, and I think how it maybe even relates to Joe Biden's dementia, which is that the Trump campaign is trying to frame this whole thing as Joe Biden is a weak leader, he's incompetent, he's just sort of old, he's senile, he doesn't really have the ability to take the reins of anything, and so he's just going to be guided by the activist side of things, right? Because Joe Biden, I mean, I'm sure you saw it, he came out and says, I do not support defunding the police. This whole mood to shift the sort of narrative, the consciousness, I don't know what you want to call it, around policing. I'm not with that whole boat. I'm with the old 90s deal of this stuff. And so the Trump campaign is panicking because they know that that is a recipe for disaster for them come November, especially with the activist push. And so they're trying to frame it as, well, the Democratic Party in general is around this idea of defund the police.
Yeah, and I've seen a couple things where Biden talks about that, and he seems to really just want to play that middle ground where he's not really committing to any kind of new change. I mean, he said he's not for defunding the police. It seems like, what you'd expect from what we already knew about Biden. He's just kind of sit there in the middle because I think the strategy, and I think he knows it, is essentially he's irrelevant in this race to some extent, right? It's Donald Trump, and then the
Right.
ballots could just have another check mark, but with just a blank spot there. It wouldn't even have to have Joe Biden's name on it, and people are just going to choose whether they
Right.
want to check Donald Trump or whoever else it is that's running. So I think Biden is just going to kind of sit there and not say anything controversial, not go too far either direction that might offend some people. And that's what we're going to see. I certainly don't expect any help from him on this issue as far as trying to move things forward in relation to what protesters want and that kind of. My expectations from him are very, very small.
Yeah, I am curious whether or not the Trump campaign is going to be able to succeed in framing the entire Democratic Party as going along with the activists. I mean, we have seen again Donald Trump absolutely failing when it comes to his coronavirus response and his general response to the protesters. The public has not generally agreed with Donald Trump's positioning there. Now, the interesting thing, though, is this idea of the maximalist position. And I want to get your opinion on this, right? Because some people are arguing that this is an ideal situation for change, which is that the activists have staked out a maximalist position of we want no more police. We're going to defund the police. Some people are talking about abolish the police. Some people are talking about defunding the police. And then you've got the Democratic Party basically saying, no, we're not on board with that. Joe Biden saying we're not on board with that, which, if you look at the polling sort of gut check, a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to defund the police. But then generally when you explain things, people might be a little bit
Right.
more sympathetic to the idea. But it's a new idea. People don't really know exactly what we're talking about here. And then you've got Donald Trump out here talking about law and order. So some people argue that this is an ideal situation for bringing about change. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's good. I think the messaging is going to be hard because this idea of defund police, and we're already seeing on the right, the pundits, they're just trying to make it like you would just cut the budget and then nothing would replace it, and you would just have this vacuum
Right.
left in cities, which is not what people are really talking about, of course. But that's how it's being sold. Well, of course, if you're sitting in your nice neighborhood that's well protected, the idea of police disappearing is very scary to you, right? So I think there's going to be some work here in how do you communicate this message to people so they understand we're not talking about creating a vacuum. We're talking about taking services that, right now the cops are a Swiss Army knife, right? Anytime something goes wrong, a cop is going to get sent out to it. Now, of course, there are cases where a cop is appropriate, but there are lots of cases where a well trained social worker might be more appropriate, and you might actually have better outcomes because you have that person handling it rather than someone who shows up with a gun and it's ready to escalate things. Social worker is probably not showing up ready to escalate and throw people to the grounds. So lots of situations where that could probably be handled in a much better way, right? But that's not what people think of when we say defund police. They're not thinking about, oh, well, why don't we shift some responsibilities to people who are maybe better trained at that kind of a thing? And I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to convince people, and or I should say, explain to people, what we mean. I mean, this is an instance where, I mean, of course, even sort of internal to the left, there's disagreements. Now, that's also not particularly surprising, right? Like even bills and laws that are already passed, right? Obamacare, for instance, there's debates about what a law which already exists even means, right? That's why we have a Supreme Court, because even when laws exist, there's no agreement about what something actually means. So, of course, there's going to be disagreements, especially when you start having a new term entering the popular consciousness. It's not in any way surprising, and so the move right now is to try to frame things how you see it. How you see it right now. It's definitely, again, definitely an interesting debate we're going to have to see. Now, one of the statistics which actually surprised me, I was surprised to see this in some ways, which is that nationally there is no evidence that more police leads to less
Right.
crime. Now, there might be some relationship between funding in some cases, but there is not a relationship between having more police officers and having less crime. So, you were mentioning there about how the right wing is trying to frame things, which is that they're going to say, well, we're just going to cut police budgets and cut police officers and then just going to have a vacuum, right? So, I actually do agree that it would be a disaster if what you did is just, okay, well, we're going to fire a bunch of police officers and have police officers trying to do the exact same amount of things that they're doing right now. I do think that that would be a disaster and it probably would lead to terrible outcomes. But if you're replacing it carefully, and having different institutions take over or developing new institutions to take over certain kinds of roles, I think that that could be, hopefully, would be much more successful.
And I think the solutions are going to be different from city to city. I mean, what my city decides to do if they move forward with something along the lines of a defund police, that's going to be different than just one city over where they have, an entirely different setup. It's going to be different for them. They're going to make different choices about what does defund mean, because essentially you're taking funds that are going into the police and you're
Right.
shifting them into other city services or creating new city services, but each city's needs are different depending on all sorts of things. And this is why the statistics is so difficult. You can look at, okay, what has crime done over the last 40 years and what is spending done, but crime seems to be related to many things. It's not just how many police are out there. You've got the economy affects crimes. You've got how our judicial system, how that works affects. I mean, there's all these
Right.
different moving parts, and you're so to come out and say, well, this we found the one thing that causes crime to go up or down. Just you have to be much more uh, sort of take a whole look at things and think, okay, how can we attack the different areas? And even crime itself, there's not just one thing that's crime. There's all sorts of various types of crime that happen for various reasons. And so there's going to it's there's going to be a different recipe for each city in figuring out how they're going to shift away from just throwing everything at the cops, right, to how are you going to have other city services handle this, hopefully in a better way than they're currently being handled.
Absolutely. The issue here is trying to reframe what we mean by crime and reframe what we mean by breaking the laws. Because if we treat everything, which is a social problem, as an issue of law violation, as an issue of crime, well, then we just send guns out everywhere. And, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail, and that can be a
Right.
disaster. All right, Chris, thanks so much for joining us. You all watching, make sure to check out Chris's channel over on YouTube. It's Political Perspective. He's got some great stuff coming out right now. I've seen it. I've seen some of his stuff recently, and it's absolutely fantastic. Make sure to check it out. All right, guys, see you all in the next one.